Stand back. My mother-in-law Valencia stepped between me and the Christmas tree like she was adjusting furniture, not blocking a person. Her voice was soft. Polite. Almost kind. The kind of tone you use when correcting someone who doesn't know the rules. The room went quiet, but not in surprise. It was the kind of silence that already knew what to do. I froze with my hands half raised, a smile still on my face because I hadn't caught up yet. The lights on the tree blinked red, then gold. Someone cleared their throat. Wrapping paper rustled as if on cue. Valencia turned away from me and reached for the first gift. She handed it to my husband's brother. Then his sister. Then their spouses. Each exchange came with a smile, a comment, a laugh. The pile under the tree thinned. Envelopes tied with red ribbon went to the grandchildren. Even the dog got something. I stood there, still smiling, because stopping would have made it real. My husband, Terrell, didn't look at me. He shifted once, like he wanted to speak, then caught his mother's eyes and went still. He stared at the floor like it might open up and save him. Heat climbed into my ears, a slow burn behind my eyes. No one said my name. No one said anything at all. When it was finally my turn, when the rhythm of the morning said it should be, I wasn't skipped loudly. I was skipped cleanly. Valencia moved on as if I wasn't there. As if the space where I stood had always been empty. I stepped back because there was nowhere else to go. Later, in the bathroom with the door locked, I pressed my palms into the counter and stared at my reflection. I told myself it was just a gift. Just a moment. Just a misunderstanding dressed up as tradition. But even then, I knew better. This wasn't about Christmas. This was a warning. And standing there, alone by the sink, I made a quiet decision. I wouldn't ask why. I wouldn't demand an explanation. I would let her believe I had stepped back. Because Christmas morning wasn't when she put me in my place. It was when she showed me exactly where she thought the power was. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories coming soon. Before that Christmas morning, before the tree and the silence and the words that would follow me for years, my life felt orderly. Not perfect. Just balanced in a way that made sense. We lived in Brookhaven, Georgia, close enough to the city to feel busy, far enough out to breathe. Our house wasn't flashy, but it was ours. I had built my days around work, routine, and the quiet pride that came from standing on my own feet. I'm Amani Whitlock, and I married into a family that valued appearances the way some families value love. Early on, I learned that order mattered. Who spoke first? Who sat where? Who made decisions and who waited to be told? My husband, Terrell Whitlock, grew up inside that structure. He didn't question it. He survived it. That was the difference. He was thoughtful, steady, and loyal in ways that were soft, not loud. Sometimes that loyalty bent toward peace instead of truth, but I didn't see that clearly at first. At the center of everything was Valencia Whitlock. She ran her household like a well-managed company. Calm voice. Perfect timing. Nothing wasted. Nothing accidental. People listened when she spoke, not because she raised her voice, but because she never had to. Family gatherings followed an unspoken script. Valencia decided the menu, the schedule, the tone. Laughter happened on cue. Disagreements dissolved before they formed. And if something fell off, it was smoothed over with a smile that said, "This isn't the moment." I told myself that was just how strong families worked. I didn't know then that strength, in that house, always flowed in one direction. And I didn't yet understand how much space you could lose in a room before anyone noticed you were gone. Christmas at Valencia's house was never casual. It was scheduled. Timed. Even joy seemed to have an order of operations. We arrived early, like always. The driveway was already full, cars lined up neatly as if they'd been measured. Inside, the smell of cinnamon and pine filled the air. The tree stood in the living room, tall and flawless, every ornament spaced just right. Nothing overlapped. Nothing was random. Valencia moved through the house in a cream sweater, greeting everyone by name, touching shoulders lightly as she passed. Each gesture felt generous, but measured. I watched her the way you watch someone who controls a room without standing in the middle of it. The seating arranged itself naturally. Or at least it looked that way. Terrell's brother Desmond Whitlock leaned against the fireplace. Terrell's sister Janelle Whitlock settled onto the couch beside the tree. The kids drifted to the floor, already eyeing the wrapped boxes. No one asked where to sit. They just knew. I helped in the kitchen, because that was expected. Valencia handed me tasks without asking if I had time or preference. I took them anyway. Being useful had always been the safest position. Terrell stayed close but distracted. He laughed easily, joked with his siblings, slipped back into the role he'd played his whole life. Watching him there, I realized how little of this space belonged to me. I was present, but not placed. When it was time for gifts, Valencia clapped her hands softly. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Children lined up without being told. The room gathered around the tree as if pulled by gravity. I stood near the edge, close enough to participate, far enough not to disrupt anything. I didn't know then that position had already been chosen for me. And that Christmas morning, it wasn't just gifts that were about to be handed out. It was order. Valencia stepped forward first, standing just to the side of the tree, close enough to touch it but never blocking anyone's view. She picked up the top gift and smiled like this was her favorite part of the day. Names were called in an order no one questioned. Desmond went first. Janelle after that. Their spouses followed, each exchange wrapped in a comment about how thoughtful the gift was, how perfect it was for them. Laughter landed where it was supposed to. Thank yous sounded rehearsed, but sincere enough. I waited. I shifted my weight once, then again. My hands folded in front of me, then dropped to my sides. I caught Terrell's eye for half a second. He smiled, quick and uncertain, then looked away. When Valencia reached for the next gift, I stepped forward slightly. Not enough to interrupt. Just enough to signal readiness. That's when she turned. She placed one hand out, palm open, not touching me but close enough to stop me cold. Stand back. She said it gently. Almost kindly. Like a hostess correcting someone who didn't know the flow of the room. For a heartbeat, I didn't move. My body hesitated, confused by how calm she sounded. No anger. No sharpness. Just instruction. The room didn't react. No gasps. No laughter. No one said my name. I stepped back because every eye told me to. Valencia turned away and continued. Another gift. Then another. The rhythm didn't change. The tree lights blinked. Paper tore. The children laughed when envelopes appeared with their names written in careful script. I stood near the wall, heat creeping up my neck, my smile fixed in place like it had been glued there. When the last gift was handed out, there was no pause. No correction. No moment where anyone noticed I'd never been called. I wasn't skipped loudly. I was skipped completely. And that was somehow worse. I didn't leave the room right away. I stood there longer than I should have, pretending to watch the kids open envelopes, pretending I hadn't just been erased in front of everyone who mattered to this family. My ears rang, not from noise, but from everything that hadn't been said. Terrell finally came over, lowering his voice like volume was the problem. He asked if I was okay. The question felt small. Careful. Designed not to upset anyone else. I told him I was fine because that was the easiest lie in the room. He nodded, relieved, and drifted back to his siblings. That was the moment it landed, not the humiliation, but the loneliness of it. I had been corrected publicly, and comfort was something I was expected to handle privately. I made my way to the hallway and into the bathroom, closing the door softly behind me. I locked it even though no one ever came looking for me during family gatherings. The mirror showed me a woman who looked composed. Hair neat. Makeup intact. No sign of the heat under my skin or the pressure in my chest. I braced my hands on the counter and breathed slowly. In. Out. I told myself it was just a gift exchange. Just tradition. Just Valencia being particular. But my body knew better. Humiliation has weight. It settles in your shoulders. It makes your spine curl inward like it's trying to protect something. I thought about all the small ways I'd adjusted myself over the years. Standing a step back. Waiting to speak. Laughing at jokes that weren't funny. This wasn't an accident. It fit too cleanly into everything that came before it. When I unlocked the door and stepped back into the hallway, the house sounded the same. Laughter. Music. Wrapping paper. No one noticed I'd been gone. That was the part that hurt the most. Because if no one noticed your absence, it meant you'd already been missing long before you stepped out of the room. Terrell found me later in the kitchen, rinsing mugs that didn't need rinsing. The sink was already full, but my hands needed something to do. He leaned against the counter and watched me for a moment before speaking. His voice was low, careful, like we were negotiating peace instead of talking about what had just happened. He said his mother didn't mean anything by it. That she was just trying to keep things moving. That maybe I'd stepped forward at the wrong time. I nodded while he talked, letting his words wash over me. None of them touched what actually hurt. I asked him why my name hadn't been called. He hesitated. Just a beat too long. Then he said he didn't know. That maybe there had been a mix-up. That we could laugh about it later. That pause told me more than his explanation. I asked if he'd noticed I hadn't received anything at all. He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he had when he didn't want to choose sides. He said Christmas wasn't about gifts. That we didn't need to make a big deal out of it. I looked at him then. Really looked. At the man who loved me, but had learned his whole life that survival meant not challenging his mother in public. I told him I wasn't upset about the gift. I was upset about the correction. About being told where I belonged. Terrell's face tightened, just slightly. He said his mother had strong opinions. That pushing back would only make things worse. That we should let it go. And in that moment, standing in that spotless kitchen, I understood something that would take me years to fully accept. If I wanted dignity in that family, I was going to have to claim it myself. Because no one else was going to hand it to me. I didn't learn about the trust that day. Not directly. Valencia was far too careful for that. The first hint came a week later, in the form of a conversation that stopped when I entered the room. Desmond and Janelle had been talking in low voices, their words dissolving into smiles the moment they noticed me. Nothing makes your instincts sharper than being excluded quietly. That night, I asked Terrell if anything had changed with the family trust. I kept my tone light, casual, like I was asking about dinner plans. He stiffened. He said his mother had made some updates. Nothing major. Just housekeeping. The kind of word people use when they don't want questions. I asked if I was still included. Terrell didn't answer right away. He opened the fridge, closed it again, then said his mother thought it made more sense to simplify things. Simplify was her favorite word. It sounded reasonable. Clean. Unemotional. I asked what that meant. Terrell swallowed like the words were sharp. Then he said the trust had been revised weeks earlier. That certain beneficiaries had been removed. Temporarily, he added, until some loose ends were resolved. I felt the same slow heat rise in my chest that I'd felt by the tree. Later I'd learned the trust wasn't the only thing changed. Valencia had updated her will and broader estate plan weeks before Christmas, too. I asked if I had done something wrong. Terrell said no. Too quickly. Like he'd rehearsed it. He said his mother felt there were conflicts of interest. That it was better to keep business and marriage separate. That she was only protecting the family. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I thanked him for telling me. Later that night, lying awake beside him, I stared at the ceiling and replayed Christmas morning in my head. The hand. The words. The way the room had obeyed. The trust hadn't been changed because of money. It had been changed because I hadn't stepped back when it mattered. Once the trust was on my mind, everything else came into focus. The family company had always hovered in the background of our lives, spoken about in careful tones, like it was both a blessing and a threat. I held shares in my name, a structure Valencia herself had helped set up years earlier during a company reorganization. At the time, she'd called it progressive. Inclusive. Those shares weren't symbolic, they came with voting rights, written into the reorganization paperwork in a way Valencia never expected me to use. Now I understood it had been conditional. A few days after the conversation about the trust, Valencia called me directly. That alone felt deliberate. She rarely reached out without an audience. She asked how I was settling back in after the holidays, her voice smooth and warm. Then she shifted, just slightly, into business. She said the company was entering a sensitive phase. That unity mattered. That disagreements could be misinterpreted by people who didn't understand the family. I listened. She said it might be wise for me to temporarily assign my voting rights to someone more experienced. Someone with a long-term view. She didn't say her own name, but it sat between us. I asked how long temporary would be. She laughed softly and said we didn't need to get into timelines yet. That trust was more important than paperwork. That's when I knew the Christmas morning humiliation hadn't been emotional. It had been strategic. I told her I'd need to review the documents with my own attorney before making any decisions. The line went quiet for a second. Then her tone cooled, just enough for me to feel it. She said she hoped I wouldn't make things difficult. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at my phone. The trust. The gifts. The call. None of it was random. She hadn't taken something from me yet. She was positioning herself to. And for the first time, I didn't feel small. I felt alert. I didn't answer Valencia right away. I let her sit with the silence she usually controlled. Instead, I pulled out the old folder I kept in the back of my desk. It held copies of documents I hadn't looked at in years, share certificates, operating agreements, notes from meetings I'd once attended out of obligation more than interest. Back then, the company felt abstract. Something that belonged to them. Something I was adjacent to, not responsible for. Now it felt very real. I read slowly, line by line, stopping when language grew dense. Certain clauses repeated. Restrictions. Conditions. Requirements tied to transfer of control. I highlighted them, not fully understanding yet, but recognizing weight when I saw it. One sentence caught my attention. It referenced mandatory disclosure in the event of reassignment beyond a defined threshold. I didn't know what that meant, not fully. But I knew disclosures were rarely casual. That evening, I told Terrell I wouldn't be signing anything until I spoke with my own attorney. His shoulders tightened. He said his mother wouldn't like that. That involving outsiders could create tension. I asked him why transparency would create tension if everything was clean. He didn't answer. He said his mother was under a lot of stress. That she built everything from the ground up. That questioning her now would feel like betrayal. I told him I wasn't questioning her. I was protecting myself. Terrell looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. Not in agreement. In surrender. That night, I emailed an attorney whose name I'd been given years earlier and never used. I kept the message short. Professional. Calm. When I hit send, I felt something shift. For the first time since Christmas morning, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. And whatever came next, it wouldn't happen on Valencia's timeline. The response from the attorney didn't come right away. Days passed. Long enough for doubt to creep in. In the meantime, Valencia's presence grew louder without her saying much at all. Group messages about family unity. Casual comments passed through Terrell about how hard his mother was working to keep everything stable. Invitations that arrived late or with details missing, just enough to remind me I was no longer central. I noticed how often my name was left out of conversations that affected me. One afternoon, while scrolling through old emails, I found something I'd forgotten existed. A forwarded message from years earlier, buried beneath newsletters and meeting reminders. It referenced a minor amendment to the company's operating agreement. At the time, it had seemed irrelevant. Now it didn't. The attachment was still there. I opened it slowly, reading past the legal framing until I reached the annotations at the bottom. Handwritten notes scanned into the document. Dates. Initials. I didn't recognize all of them. But one set stood out. The same initials appeared repeatedly, attached to transactions that had never been discussed in any meeting I'd attended. Side entries. Adjustments that didn't match the public reports. My stomach tightened. This wasn't proof. Not yet. It was inconsistency. A question mark. The kind of thing you couldn't accuse someone over, but also couldn't ignore once you'd seen it. When Nigel Broadwell finally called, his voice was measured. He said my voting rights weren't as simple as Valencia was making them sound. That transferring them would trigger review obligations. Possibly more. I asked what kind. He paused, then said, the kind that brings old records back into the light. When the call ended, I sat in silence, the house too quiet around me. Christmas morning hadn't been about gifts. It had been about leverage. And Valencia had just told me exactly which pressure point she was afraid of. I didn't confront Valencia with what I'd learned. Not then. Not even a hint. Instead, I paid attention. I noticed how often she asked Terrell what I was doing during the day. How casually she brought up deadlines and documents, always framed as suggestions. How quickly the warmth disappeared when I asked questions instead of giving reassurance. The pressure was subtle, but constant. A reminder that my silence was expected. One evening, Terrell told me his mother was worried. He said she felt I was pulling away from the family. That she didn't understand why I was being distant. I asked him if she'd mentioned the trust again. He shook his head. Too quickly. I asked if she'd mentioned the voting rights. He hesitated, then said she was hoping we could resolve things internally. Resolve. Another word she used when she wanted control without resistance. That night, I opened the scanned document again. I enlarged the margins, studied the notes, traced dates across years. Patterns began to form, not conclusions, just alignment. Enough to understand why disclosure would be dangerous. Enough to understand why Christmas morning had been chosen so carefully. Public. Quiet. Final. She hadn't humiliated me because she was angry. She'd humiliated me because she thought I was cornered. I stood in the dark living room, the house asleep around me, and felt something settle in my chest. Not fear. Not rage. Clarity. I wasn't going to fight her openly. I wasn't going to demand my place back at her table. I was going to let time do what confrontation couldn't. Let procedures move at their pace. Let records speak. Let consequences arrive without my fingerprints on them. Christmas morning had been her warning. This realization was mine. And with it came a quiet certainty. The next time she told me to stand back, it wouldn't be a command. It would be permission. The first thing I noticed. Nigel didn't rush me. When he finally sat across from me, his office quiet and spare, he didn't ask what I wanted to do. He asked what I understood. There's a difference. One invites impulse. The other demands honesty. I told him everything I knew. And everything I didn't. He listened without interrupting, flipping through the documents I'd brought with steady hands. When he reached the highlighted clauses, he slowed down. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to notice. He explained that my voting rights weren't just symbolic. They were structural. Built to prevent exactly the kind of consolidation Valencia was attempting. He said transferring them wouldn't be simple, no matter how gently it was framed. I asked him about the disclosure language. He nodded once and said that clause existed because of historic irregularities. He didn't say whose. He didn't need to. He warned me about time. About process. About how none of this would move quickly, no matter how clear things eventually became. Then he asked me the question Valencia never had. What outcome do you want? I thought about Christmas morning. About the hand. The voice. The room that obeyed without being told. I said I didn't want revenge. I wanted distance. Safety. A future where my child wouldn't grow up learning when to stand back. Nigel said that was achievable, but it would require restraint. Letting institutions do their work. Not reacting when pressure came. I told him I could wait. As I left his office, the city moved around me like nothing had changed. Cars passed. People walked. Life continued. But inside me, something had shifted. I wasn't trying to reclaim a place at Valencia's table anymore. I was building my own. Waiting turned out to be harder than I expected. Once Nigel began making formal inquiries, everything slowed to a crawl. Requests went out. Responses came back partial, delayed, or wrapped in language that answered nothing directly. Every step forward seemed to require 2 pauses. That was the friction he'd warned me about. Banks needed time. Records had to be pulled from archives. Some files existed only as scans of scans, their edges blurred by years of transfers. Each delay carried plausible explanations. None of them felt accidental. Valencia sensed the shift before I said a word. Her calls became more frequent, though never direct. She asked how I was feeling. Whether I was overwhelmed. Whether I needed help simplifying things. I told her I was fine. I thanked her for her concern. I gave her nothing she could push against. Terrell struggled the most. He hated the waiting. The not knowing. He asked if this was really necessary. If involving attorneys was worth the strain it was putting on the family. I told him truth had weight, and weight took time to surface. He didn't argue. But he didn't relax either. Then came the first request for records from the company itself. Nothing alarming on its face. Routine language. Compliance phrasing that sounded harmless unless you knew what it touched. The response from Valencia's office was polite. Cooperative. And incomplete. Nigel flagged the gaps without drama. He didn't accuse. He noted. He documented. Each missing line item was small on its own. Together, they formed a shape. I lay awake some nights wondering if I'd misread everything. If the humiliation had been coincidence. If silence would have been easier. But every morning, another delay arrived. And with it, quiet confirmation that I hadn't imagined the pressure. Something was being protected. And it wasn't me. Nigel called me late one afternoon, his voice steady but more focused than usual. He asked if I had time to talk privately. Not urgently. Deliberately. He told me the disclosure triggers tied to my voting rights weren't theoretical. They were safeguards added after an internal review years ago. Not public. Not widely discussed. Quietly implemented. I asked what had prompted them. He paused, then said there had been concerns about transactions that didn't follow standard reporting paths. Nothing proven. Nothing resolved. Just enough irregularity to justify future oversight. That clause, he said, was meant to protect the company from itself. If I transferred my voting rights, even temporarily, it would force a reconciliation process. Old records pulled. Amendments cross-checked. Decisions traced back to their origin. I asked if that would automatically expose wrongdoing. He said exposure didn't work like that. It wasn't a spotlight. It was erosion. Questions that led to more questions. Gaps that demanded explanation. And once the process started, it couldn't be paused for comfort. I told him Valencia had been pushing for urgency. He let out a breath, quiet but telling. He said pressure usually followed fear, not confidence. That night, Valencia called again. She sounded warmer than ever, like she was trying to wrap the conversation in familiarity. She said the company needed clarity. That prolonged uncertainty could harm everyone. That she trusted me to do the right thing. I listened until she finished. Then I said I was still reviewing my options and wouldn't be rushed. The silence on the line stretched longer than before. When she spoke again, the warmth was gone. She said she hoped I understood what I was risking. After we hung up, I didn't feel threatened. I felt confirmed. Because people protecting nothing don't panic over process. And people with clean hands don't fear daylight. I stopped trying to explain myself after that. No more reassurance. No more softening my words so they would land easier. I answered questions when they were asked and stayed silent when they weren't. That restraint unsettled everyone. Valencia responded by tightening her grip on the family in quieter ways. Dinners happened without me. Decisions were announced after they were already made. Terrell came home carrying fragments of conversations I hadn't been invited into. He told me his mother was worried about optics. About how things looked to people outside the family. He said she felt exposed. I asked him why exposure was frightening if there was nothing to hide. He didn't answer. Instead, he asked if I could just give her what she wanted so things could go back to normal. That word again. Normal. The version of peace that required me to be smaller. I told him I wouldn't trade silence for comfort. Not anymore. The next delay came from the bank. A records request was returned incomplete due to archival limitations. Nigel flagged it as unusual, not obstructive enough to challenge outright, but consistent with the pattern we were documenting. Each obstacle added time. Each delay stretched patience. I focused on what I could control. I reorganized my finances. I separated accounts. I built distance without announcing it. Practical steps that didn't look like resistance but felt like insulation. At night, I caught myself replaying Christmas morning. The exact angle of Valencia's hand. The tone of her voice. The way everyone else had waited for instruction. The memory no longer burned. It sharpened. Because for the first time, I wasn't standing back. I was standing still. And letting the ground shift under her instead. Valencia changed tactics. The calls stopped. The warmth disappeared. In its place came concern, performed, public, and carefully distributed. I started hearing about myself through other people. Comments passed to Terrell from relatives. Questions framed as worry. Was I overwhelmed? Was motherhood on my mind? Had I always been this distant? Each one was a soft rewrite of the story. I wasn't principled. I was unstable. Terrell struggled with it more than I did. He hated being the bridge. Hated repeating things he didn't fully believe but didn't know how to reject. One night, he told me his mother felt hurt. That she believed I was punishing her. That my silence was aggressive. I asked him when restraint had become an attack. He didn't have an answer. At the same time, Nigel forwarded me a memo from the company's compliance team. Routine language again. But the request went deeper this time, asking for historical documentation tied to specific periods. The response from Valencia's office was delayed longer than before. When it finally arrived, entire sections were missing. Nigel didn't escalate. He logged it. He added it to the timeline. He let the absence speak for itself. I realized then how differently power looked from the outside. Valencia had always controlled the room. But rooms weren't where this was unfolding anymore. Process didn't care about reputation. Procedure didn't respond to charm. The pressure Valencia applied socially was loud. The pressure building institutionally was quiet. And it was winning. That night, Terrell asked me if I was sure I wanted to keep going. I told him I wasn't pushing anything. I was just not stepping back. And for the first time, he didn't argue. He just sat with the weight of it. The first real doubt crept in when nothing happened. Weeks passed with no dramatic fallout. No confrontation. No announcement. Just the slow churn of requests and responses that looked insignificant from the outside. I started to wonder if I'd overestimated everything. Nigel assured me this was normal. That compliance work rarely announced itself. That pressure worked best when it didn't feel like pressure at all. Still, uncertainty has a way of getting under your skin. Valencia, sensing the lull, reappeared, this time with patience instead of urgency. She invited us to dinner. Just family. No agenda, she said. An olive branch. Terrell wanted to go. He needed the reassurance that things weren't permanently broken. I agreed, knowing observation was sometimes more useful than absence. The dinner was perfect. Too perfect. Valencia laughed easily. She asked about my health. About the baby. She even apologized, lightly, for any misunderstandings over the holidays. It wasn't an apology. It was a reset attempt. I accepted it without comment. Later, as dessert was served, she mentioned the company again. Casually. She said the uncertainty was causing stress for people who relied on leadership to be decisive. She looked at me when she said it. I met her gaze and said nothing. The silence stretched just long enough to make the point. When we left, Terrell exhaled like he'd been holding his breath all evening. He said maybe things were finally smoothing out. I didn't correct him. Because the next morning, Nigel forwarded a notice from an external reviewer. A secondary audit request. Narrow in scope. Specific in timing. Someone else had noticed the gaps. And once outside eyes enter a process, there is no hostess's voice gentle enough to make them stand back. The audit notice changed the temperature. Valencia didn't call me that day. Or the next. The space she'd once filled with commentary and concern went silent, and that silence felt heavier than her pressure ever had. Terrell heard about it first, through his brother. Not details, just tension. Meetings that ended abruptly. Advisors who suddenly weren't available. Language that shifted from confidence to caution. At home, he paced. He asked what an external review meant. He asked if this was serious. I told him it meant questions were being asked by people who didn't owe anyone comfort. That night, I received my first direct email from the compliance team. It was brief. Polite. It thanked me for my cooperation and noted that my voting rights would remain unchanged pending review. Pending. A word that carries time inside it. Valencia finally reached out the following evening. Her message was short. She said she needed to speak with me privately. Urgently. I didn't respond right away. When I did, I told her I was unavailable but happy to communicate through counsel. The reply came almost instantly. A single line. She said she hoped I understood the consequences of involving outsiders. I forwarded it to Nigel without comment. He replied with 2 words, documented. That night, I lay awake listening to the quiet of our house. Terrell slept beside me, restless even in his dreams. For the first time, I felt the balance shift. Not dramatically. Not visibly. But enough to know Valencia was no longer directing the rhythm. She was reacting to it. And in that space, between reaction and control, I found something steadier than anger. I found patience. Because the moment someone stops managing appearances and starts managing fear, the ending has already begun. The escalation didn't come with shouting or threats. It came wrapped in paper. A formal letter arrived at our house addressed to Terrell, not me. The language was careful, legal without being aggressive. It referenced internal concern and potential misalignment. It requested a meeting to discuss the future of our involvement with the company. Valencia's fingerprints were all over it, even though her name wasn't. Terrell read it twice, then handed it to me without a word. His hands were shaking. He asked if this was because of me. I said it was because of fear. That afternoon, Nigel confirmed what the letter was meant to do. It was a pressure move. An attempt to shift the narrative from oversight to loyalty. From procedure to family obligation. He said we had 2 options. We could attend the meeting informally and risk being cornered. Or we could respond formally and trigger a review protocol that removed emotion from the equation entirely. I didn't hesitate. We responded in writing. Brief. Professional. We requested that any discussion include counsel and be recorded as part of the ongoing review. The reply came the next morning. The meeting was postponed. No explanation. No new date. Just delay. That delay told me everything. Valencia wasn't confident enough to proceed under scrutiny. She needed rooms she could control. Voices she could quiet. That leverage was gone now. Later that day, another notice came in, this one from the external reviewer. A request for documentation tied to a narrow window of transactions. Specific dates. Specific approvals. I recognized the window immediately. It lined up with the annotations I'd seen months earlier. This wasn't exposure yet. But it was direction. And for the first time since Christmas morning, I felt the room change, not because someone told me to stand back, but because no one could tell me where to stand at all. From the outside, nothing looked different. The company still operated. Family gatherings still happened. Valencia still hosted, still smiled, still spoke with the same measured calm to anyone who didn't know where to look. But inside the process, the pace had changed. Nigel explained it to me like pressure underwater. You don't see it building, but once it reaches a certain depth, movement becomes restricted. Every action costs more effort. Every misstep leaves a mark. The external reviewer's questions narrowed. They weren't broader anymore. They were deeper. Requests tied to specific approvals, signatures, and timing. Cross-referenced against records that had once been considered settled. Valencia's office responded faster now. Too fast. Documents arrived neatly packaged, explanations attached before anyone asked for them. That urgency didn't reassure anyone. Terrell began to see it too. He mentioned how often his mother sounded tired. Distracted. How she repeated herself in conversations, circling the same points like she was trying to convince herself. One evening, she called him while we were eating dinner. He stepped into the hallway, voice low. When he came back, his face was pale. He said his mother felt attacked. That she believed the family was being torn apart by outsiders who didn't understand their history. I asked him if she'd mentioned the transactions. He said no. That answer mattered more than anything else. If she were confident, she'd defend them. Explain them. Dismiss them. Instead, she avoided them entirely. That night, Nigel sent another update. The reviewer had flagged discrepancies significant enough to require expanded scope. More time. More documentation. Still no accusations. Just process. I closed my laptop and sat in the quiet, thinking about how long Valencia had controlled outcomes by controlling access. Now access was gone. And all that remained were records, timelines, and questions that didn't care how gently she spoke. The unraveling had begun. Slowly. Exactly the way she'd feared most. Valencia tried to regain control through emotion. She invited Terrell to lunch alone. Not a meeting. Not a discussion. Just mother and son. He went, hopeful in a way that made my chest ache. When he came home, his shoulders were slumped like he'd aged years in a single afternoon. He told me she cried. Not loudly. Quietly. Carefully. She said she felt betrayed. That she'd sacrificed everything for the family, only to be questioned by strangers because of someone who didn't understand the history. She never said my name. She didn't have to. Terrell said she asked him to talk to me. To convince me to pull back. To end the review before it did permanent damage. I asked what she'd said about the documents. He shook his head. She deflected. Said it was all being blown out of proportion. That technicalities were being used as weapons. I told him that technicalities were how systems protected people when power was uneven. He didn't argue. Later that night, Valencia sent me a message. Just one line. She said she hoped I was satisfied. I didn't respond. The next update came from Nigel the following morning. The external reviewer had requested in-person interviews with several executives. Routine, he said. Standard procedure once scope expanded. Valencia was included. That was new. I imagined her sitting in a room she didn't control, answering questions she couldn't redirect. Not accused. Not confronted. Just required to explain. For the first time, I felt a flicker of something like sympathy. Not for her fear, but for the inevitability of it. Because power built on silence doesn't collapse in a single moment. It dissolves. And there is no graceful way to stop it once the process begins. The interviews didn't happen right away. Schedules conflicted. Council requested extensions. Calendars filled and emptied again. Another layer of delay settled over everything, heavier this time because it came after momentum. I felt the doubt return. Had this gone far enough to matter? Or just far enough to strain everything without changing the outcome? Nigel reminded me that resistance often disguised itself as patience. That slowing things down was sometimes the last tool left to people who couldn't stop a process outright. Valencia leaned into that tactic fully. She became accommodating. Polite. Almost pleasant again. Emails were answered promptly. Documents arrived with apologies for earlier confusion. She framed every delay as cooperation misunderstood. It was convincing. Almost. Until Nigel showed me the comparison chart. Dates that didn't align. Versions of the same document with different timestamps. Signatures that appeared out of sequence. Nothing dramatic. Nothing illegal on its face. But enough to keep the review alive. At home, Terrell avoided the topic altogether. The strain showed in small ways. Shorter conversations. Longer silences. Nights where he stared at the ceiling long after the lights were out. I wanted to reassure him. To promise that this would end soon. I couldn't. Because the truth was, I didn't know when it would end. Only that stepping away now would lock the story in Valencia's favor forever. That evening, Nigel forwarded a brief update. The reviewer had denied further extensions. Interviews would proceed as scheduled. No flexibility. No accommodation. I sat with the message open on my phone for a long time. This wasn't justice yet. It wasn't even exposure. But it was commitment. The kind that doesn't ask if you're comfortable before moving forward. And once it's made, there is no standing back from it. My son Malachi Whitlock was born on a quiet morning, the kind that doesn't announce itself with drama. No rush. No emergency. Just steady breaths and a weight placed on my chest that changed everything. Malachi's cry was small but determined. His fingers curled around mine like they already understood the concept of holding on. In that hospital room, the noise of reviews and records faded into something distant. For a few hours, the world narrowed to skin and warmth and the simple truth that time moves forward whether you're ready or not. Terrell cried when he held him. Not the restrained kind he'd learned growing up. The open kind. The kind that comes from relief mixed with fear and hope all at once. Valencia sent flowers. White. Elegant. No card. I stared at them longer than I should have, wondering what message silence was meant to carry this time. Nigel texted that afternoon. Just a short note. The interviews had begun. Not all at once. Staggered. Methodical. He said nothing about outcomes. Only that cooperation was being noted. Inconsistencies were being tracked. I didn't respond right away. I watched Malachi sleep, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that felt more certain than anything else in my life. I thought about Christmas morning. About the way space had been taken from me with a single phrase. I realized then that this had never really been about me. It was about what came after. About who would learn when to step back, and who would learn they never had to. That night, as the hospital lights dimmed and the room went quiet, I made a promise I didn't say out loud. Whatever this process cost, it would not teach my son silence. And whatever power fell away from others would not be replaced by fear. Only by boundaries. Only by time. Bringing Malachi home changed the rhythm of our days. Nights blurred into mornings. Time broke into smaller pieces measured by feedings and sleep. The world outside our house felt distant, like something happening behind glass. Valencia didn't come to see him. She asked Terrell for pictures. She commented on how small he looked. How delicate. She said she would visit once things settled. Nothing about us felt unsettled. Only her. I used the quiet to do what I should have done years earlier. I separated our finances completely. Accounts, beneficiaries, emergency plans. Nothing dramatic. Just deliberate. Nigel reviewed what mattered and left the rest untouched. Protection didn't have to look like defiance. The updates from the review continued. Still procedural. Still calm. Interviews completed. Follow-ups scheduled. Clarifications requested. Nigel said the tone had shifted. Not confrontational. Evaluative. Like the process was deciding how much weight to apply without collapsing the structure all at once. Terrell noticed it too. He stopped defending his mother reflexively. When her name came up, he listened instead of reacting. One night, while Malachi slept between us in his bassinet, Terrell said something that surprised me. He said he didn't remember his mother ever being this unsure. That uncertainty mattered. People who rely on control don't adapt well to ambiguity. They look for edges. For leverage. For places to press. Valencia was running out of both. I rocked Malachi gently, feeling his breath against my arm. He didn't know about trusts or audits or power. He didn't need to. The work happening now wasn't about winning. It was about removing the conditions that made losing inevitable. And for the first time since Christmas morning, I felt something close to peace, not because the danger was gone, but because it no longer owned my attention. The first visible consequence didn't come from the family. It came from the outside. A longtime banking partner quietly stepped back from a line of credit the company had relied on for years. No explanation beyond internal review. No drama. Just a change in terms that forced adjustments Valencia hadn't planned for. Terrell heard about it through Desmond, who sounded confused more than alarmed. Things were being reassessed. Advisors were suddenly cautious. Words like temporary and precautionary started showing up in conversations where certainty used to live. Valencia finally called me after weeks of silence. She didn't mention the bank. Or the review. Or the interviews. She asked about Malachi. I told her he was healthy. Growing fast. She said she hoped to meet him soon. That family mattered more than anything else. I waited. She didn't fill the silence. When she spoke again, her voice was tighter. She said uncertainty was spreading. That people were nervous. That stability was important for everyone involved. I told her stability came from transparency. The line went quiet. She said I didn't understand the damage I was causing. I told her damage wasn't new. It was just becoming visible. After we hung up, my hands shook, not from fear, but from the release of something I'd been holding in my chest for months. Nigel's update arrived that evening. Additional institutions had flagged exposure risk. Nothing public. Nothing final. Just caution compounding on caution. That was how long-game consequences worked. No explosion. No single moment to blame. Just doors closing softly. One by one. And for the first time, Valencia wasn't deciding who stood where in the room. She was discovering how small the room had become without her permission. The phrase came back to me one night while I was pacing the living room with Malachi tucked against my shoulder. Stand back. It echoed differently now. Not as a command, but as instruction. Not meant for me, but for the part of myself that had once believed closeness was safety. I thought about how often I'd stepped aside without being asked. How I'd learned to read rooms, to soften edges, to disappear just enough to keep peace intact. That version of me had survived. But she wasn't needed anymore. Nigel sent a brief update earlier that day. The review was nearing completion of its initial phase. Findings were being consolidated. Recommendations drafted. He didn't speculate. He never did. But the language had changed. Less conditional. More definitive. Valencia hadn't called in days. Not to ask about the baby. Not to check in. The silence felt intentional, like she was waiting for something, an opening, a reversal, a signal that this could still be undone. There wasn't one. Terrell noticed it too. He said his mother sounded distant when they spoke. Like she was measuring her words carefully for the first time. I held Malachi closer, feeling his weight, his warmth. He trusted without knowing why. That kind of trust deserved protection, not performance. Standing back wasn't weakness. It was distance. It was knowing when not to reach. The power Valencia had wielded came from proximity. From being close enough to correct, to guide, to redirect. I had stepped out of that reach. And now, without confrontation or spectacle, the space between us had become unbridgeable. Not because I pushed her away. But because I finally understood where not to stand. And I stayed there. The notice came on an ordinary afternoon. No courier. No stamped envelope. Just an email forwarded by Nigel with a short note, "This moves things into the next phase." I read the attachment slowly, even though the language was familiar by now. The external review had concluded its preliminary findings. Certain transactions required further examination. Governance changes were recommended. Oversight would be expanded. No accusations. No conclusions. Just momentum. Valencia wasn't mentioned by name, but the implications were clear. Authority would be redistributed. Decision-making narrowed. Long-standing autonomy reduced to compliance. Terrell sat beside me as I read. He didn't ask questions. He didn't defend anyone. He just nodded, like someone finally seeing the shape of something they'd lived inside for years. That evening, Valencia called. Her voice sounded tired. Not controlled. Not composed. Just tired. She said the family was under stress. That this wasn't how she'd imagined things going. That mistakes might have been made. I listened. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She circled the edges of accountability without stepping into it. She asked if there was anything I could do to help calm things down. I told her the process was no longer mine to control. That answer ended the conversation. When the call disconnected, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Not for what was happening, but for what had already been lost long before Christmas morning. It didn't end with justice. It ended with inevitability. With the understanding that some outcomes don't need force. They just need time. And patience. And the willingness to stand exactly where you are, without stepping back, and without stepping in. By the time spring arrived, the noise had faded. No more urgent calls. No more half answers. Just the steady hum of things adjusting to a new shape. Valencia withdrew without announcing it. She stopped hosting. Stopped volunteering opinions. Meetings that once centered around her now ended without mention of her name at all. Authority didn't disappear, it redistributed, quietly and without ceremony. Nigel explained that oversight had a way of changing behavior even before conclusions were reached. People became cautious. Decisions slowed. Power learned to ask permission. That shift reached the family next. Desmond mentioned that advisors were now communicating through counsel instead of directly. Janelle stopped talking about future plans. Conversations stayed on safe ground, avoiding the company entirely. Valencia called less often. When she did, she sounded measured in a different way, not controlled, but careful. like someone testing ice after realizing it might not hold. Terrell noticed it most. He said it felt strange not orbiting his mother's certainty. Like stepping into a room without a center. At home, life moved forward. Malachi grew heavier in my arms. His cries sharpened into preferences. His presence grounded me in something more solid than outcome. One afternoon, I found myself folding laundry while sunlight filled the room, and I realized I hadn't thought about Christmas in weeks. Not the tree. Not the hand. Not the words. The power of humiliation is that it tries to freeze you in the moment it happens. The power of time is that it refuses to cooperate. Valencia's influence wasn't collapsing loudly. It was thinning. And for the first time, I wasn't waiting for something to happen. I was already living past it. The first time I saw Valencia in months, it was in a place she couldn't control. A conference room. Neutral walls. No family photos. No holiday decorations. Just a long table and a clock that ticked too loudly. She arrived early and sat near the end, not the center. Her posture was straight, but her hands kept adjusting the papers in front of her, aligning edges that didn't need aligning. When I walked in with Nigel, she looked up quickly, then away. Not in anger. In calculation. This wasn't a family meeting. There was no hierarchy to lean on. No room to host. The others arrived one by one, advisors, reviewers, people whose titles mattered more than names. The conversation stayed procedural. Calm. Focused. Questions were asked. Valencia answered them. She didn't confess. She didn't explain. She reframed. Used phrases like standard practice and reasonable discretion. She emphasized intent over outcome. But intent wasn't what was being reviewed. Timelines were referenced. Documents cross-checked. Follow-up questions layered over answers that no longer fit as neatly as they once had. At one point, she glanced at me. Just once. Her expression wasn't hostile. It was searching. As if she were trying to locate the moment she'd lost control. When the meeting ended, there was no verdict. No confrontation. Just next steps. But something fundamental had shifted. She gathered her papers slowly, as if waiting for someone to speak to her. No one did. As she left the room alone, I felt no triumph. Only confirmation. Because the power she'd once wielded so easily depended on rooms like her living room. And this wasn't one of them. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They came in adjustments. Revisions. Quiet decisions made in rooms Valencia no longer entered. Nigel explained that governance changes had been accepted. Oversight committees expanded. Certain approvals now required multiple signatures instead of one. Authority that had once moved freely now had to pass through layers. Nothing illegal was declared. Nothing dramatic announced. But control had been diluted. That dilution showed up everywhere. A planned expansion was paused. A long-standing vendor contract wasn't renewed. Advisory fees climbed as caution replaced confidence. Each change was defensible on its own. Together, they reshaped the company into something slower and less forgiving. Valencia's frustration surfaced indirectly. She complained to Terrell about bureaucracy. About outsiders who didn't understand nuance. About how efficiency had been sacrificed for appearances. She never mentioned the review by name. She didn't have to. The family felt it too. Conversations turned practical. Less about vision, more about compliance. Desmond sounded tired when he talked about work. Janelle stopped volunteering opinions altogether. At home, I watched it unfold from a distance I'd earned. I didn't attend meetings. I didn't offer commentary. I let the process do what processes do when they're no longer being steered. One afternoon, Terrell said something quietly while we were watching Malachi sleep. He said he finally understood why his mother had always hated waiting. Waiting removes leverage. It forces you to live inside uncertainty instead of managing it. Valencia had built her power on momentum and access. Now she had neither. And the system she'd once controlled was teaching her the same lesson she'd taught me on Christmas morning. Stand back. And watch. The family adjusted in small, unspoken ways. No one named the shift, but everyone felt it. Invitations became neutral. Conversations careful. The old certainty that Valencia would decide and everyone else would fall in line was gone. Desmond stopped calling for advice. Janelle deferred decisions she once would have made confidently. The family group thread grew quieter, messages limited to logistics and birthdays. Valencia's presence lingered like an echo instead of a voice. Terrell changed too. He stopped filtering his words before speaking to me. When his mother complained, he listened without absorbing it. When she hinted at blame, he didn't rush to soften it. One evening, he admitted something he'd never said before. He said growing up, compliance had always felt safer than understanding. That he'd learned early which questions cost you comfort. Saying it out loud seemed to loosen something in him. I didn't interrupt. I didn't rush him toward absolution. This wasn't about forgiveness. It was about recognition. At the same time, Nigel confirmed that oversight measures would remain in place indefinitely. No timeline for reversal. No quiet return to the way things had been. Stability had been redefined. Valencia called less often. When she did, her tone stayed careful. Polite. Almost formal. She no longer corrected me. That absence mattered more than any apology could have. Because correction had always been her language of power. And without it, the relationship shifted into something unfamiliar. Not repaired. Just limited. And for the first time, limitation felt like safety, not loss. Not exile. But boundary. The invitation arrived without ceremony. A family gathering. No holiday. No agenda. Just a request to come by the house one afternoon. Valencia's house. The same rooms where everything used to orbit her voice. Terrell asked if I wanted to go. Not if we should. If I wanted to. That distinction mattered. I said yes, not out of obligation, but curiosity. I wanted to see what the space felt like without the rules I'd once followed automatically. The house looked the same. The furniture untouched. The photos still carefully arranged. But the energy had shifted. Like a stage after the lights come up and the audience realizes the show is over. Valencia greeted us at the door. No correction. No instruction. Just a nod and a smile that didn't quite settle. We sat in the living room. The tree was gone. The space where it once stood felt larger than it should have. Conversation stayed polite. Surface level. Weather. Schedules. Nothing about the company. Nothing about the review. At one point, Valencia looked at Malachi sleeping in his carrier and reached out instinctively. Then she stopped. Her hand hovered, uncertain, before lowering back to her side. No one said anything. That hesitation said more than any argument ever had. She asked if I was doing well. I said yes. And for the first time, it wasn't defensive. It wasn't brave. It was simply true. When we left, Terrell squeezed my hand in the car. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. The visit hadn't been about reconciliation. It had been about measurement. And what Valencia measured that day was distance. Not imposed. Chosen. The moment didn't arrive with drama. It came during a smaller gathering weeks later, one Valencia hadn't planned but had agreed to host. A few relatives. A casual afternoon. Nothing ceremonial. Malachi was restless, fussing in my arms as conversations drifted around us. I stood near the doorway, rocking him gently, giving him space from the noise. Valencia crossed the room without announcing herself. Old habit. She reached out as if to take him, her body already moving into position. I didn't step back. I shifted slightly, just enough to keep Malachi close, and met her eyes. Stand back. I said it calmly. Not loudly. Not unkindly. The room went still. Valencia froze, her hand suspended in the air. For a second, confusion crossed her face, like she couldn't place what had gone wrong. Then recognition landed. This time, no one moved on her behalf. No one filled the silence. She lowered her hand. I adjusted Malachi against my shoulder and turned slightly away, creating space without spectacle. The conversation resumed in small, careful voices, like everyone understood something had changed and didn't need it explained. Valencia didn't argue. She didn't correct me. She didn't smile. She stepped back. Later, as we were leaving, she stood near the door, watching us go. She didn't speak. Neither did I. Outside, the air felt lighter than it had in years. Terrell let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. I looked down at Malachi, his eyes half closed, his trust absolute. The words that once reduced me had returned, not as a warning, not as humiliation, but as a boundary. And this time, the room listened to me. The reaction came quietly, in the days that followed. No one called to ask what had happened. No one demanded explanations. The family absorbed it the way families absorb weather, by adjusting without comment. Desmond stopped by one afternoon with a gift for Malachi. He stayed only a few minutes. He didn't bring up Valencia. He didn't need to. His tone was careful, respectful, like he understood the lines had shifted. Janelle sent a message later that week. Just a photo of something she'd baked, followed by a heart. No subtext. No triangulation. Neutral ground. Even the children responded without being told. They stayed close to their parents during visits, waiting for cues that never came. The room no longer revolved around correction. It revolved around comfort. Valencia withdrew again. Not abruptly. Gradually. She hosted less. Spoke less. When she did appear, she stayed on the edges, observing instead of directing. I never heard my name used as a warning again. Terrell noticed how quickly things normalized without her guidance. How easily conversations found their own rhythm. He said it felt strange, realizing how much effort had gone into maintaining an order that no one had actually asked for. At home, I thought about that Christmas morning. About how silence had once enforced her authority. Now silence meant acceptance. Not approval. Not forgiveness. Just acknowledgement. I hadn't taken anything from her. I'd simply stopped giving her access. And the family, without instruction, without drama, had followed that lead. Power doesn't always announce when it moves. Sometimes it just changes hands quietly. And everyone feels it. Even if no one ever says the words out loud. The aftermath didn't feel victorious. It felt thin. Like air after a storm has passed and left everything exposed. Valencia didn't reach out after that gathering. No call. No message. No attempt to reframe what had happened. The silence wasn't strategic this time. It was retreat. Terrell said she'd been keeping to herself. Canceling plans. Letting calls go unanswered. He spoke without judgment, like he was observing weather patterns instead of a person. I felt a flicker of sadness then. Not for what she'd lost, but for what she'd never learned to keep. Control had been her language of care. Correction her version of closeness. Without them, she didn't know how to reach anyone. That loss wasn't mine to fix. Nigel confirmed that the review would remain open for monitoring, even as active scrutiny slowed. Oversight had become structural. Permanent enough to matter. Nothing would return to the way it had been. And I didn't want it to. At home, I packed away the last of the holiday decorations I'd avoided all year. Ornaments I'd once associated with obligation now felt neutral. Just objects. Just memories. I realized then that justice hadn't arrived with celebration or relief. It had arrived with quiet finality. The illusion of family harmony had dissolved, and in its place was something simpler. Honest. Limited. Real. I mourned the version of family I'd hoped for once. The version where inclusion didn't require compliance. But grief doesn't mean regret. It means clarity. And clarity is a kind of peace you earn, not something you're given. I closed the storage box and stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Then I turned off the light and walked away. Closure didn't arrive as forgiveness. It arrived as distance that no longer needed explanation. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. Stopped wondering what I should have said or done differently. The past lost its grip once it stopped demanding resolution. Valencia remained a presence in the family, but not a force. When her name came up, it did so neutrally, like a reference point instead of a warning. That shift told me everything I needed to know. Terrell found his footing too. He spoke to his mother when he wanted to, not when he felt obligated. He set limits without apology. Watching him learn that was its own kind of healing. I focused on Malachi. On mornings filled with light and quiet. On routines that belonged only to us. On building a home where correction didn't masquerade as love. Sometimes, when I rocked him to sleep, I thought about the woman I'd been when I first joined that family. How carefully I'd learned to stand. How often I'd stepped aside without realizing it. I didn't resent her. She did what she needed to survive. But she wasn't who I was anymore. Justice had happened without spectacle. Karma without cruelty. The kind that unfolds slowly enough to feel inevitable instead of engineered. Valencia never apologized. She didn't need to. The consequences spoke more clearly than words ever could. And I didn't need reconciliation to feel whole. I needed alignment. Between my values and my actions. Between my boundaries and my peace. That alignment held. And in holding it, I felt something settle inside me, quiet, solid, and lasting. Not closure like an ending. Closure like a foundation. The following Christmas was smaller. No formal gathering. No assigned roles. Just our house, warm lights, and a tree we decorated slowly, without rules about where anything belonged. Malachi sat on the floor, more interested in the boxes than the gifts inside them. Terrell laughed easily, unguarded in a way I hadn't seen before. The morning unfolded without choreography. No one told anyone where to stand. I caught myself pausing once, out of habit, waiting for a cue that never came. When I realized it, I smiled and kept moving. Later that afternoon, as sunlight stretched across the living room, I thought about how much power Valencia had once held over a single word. How easily it had reshaped a room. Words only work when people agree to carry them. I no longer did. Valencia sent a brief message that day. Simple. Polite. Wishing us a peaceful holiday. I read it, acknowledged it, and put my phone down. No wait. No charge. Just information. That was the final shift. Not silence as punishment. Not distance as revenge. But space as choice. As Malachi fell asleep against my chest, I looked around the room and felt something I hadn't felt the year before. Ownership. Not of assets. Not of outcomes. Of myself. Christmas morning had once been used to show me my place. Now it reminded me that place is something you define, not something you're assigned. I didn't need to stand back. I didn't need to step forward. I was already exactly where I belonged. And for the first time, that was enough. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it. If you have a unique story of your own, share it in the comments below. Thank you for listening.